Okay, great. So hello again and welcome to the Science Community of Practice featuring patterns of vegetation change in the Yukon, an opportunity to respond to change. So we are hosting this talk with respect and gratitude on the traditional territories of the Kwanlundun First Nation and Tan Quechan Council. My name is Monique Chatterton. I am the Science Policy Advisor working with the Office of the Science Advisor for Yukon Government. The Science Advisor, Sabrina Kinsella, I see is also in attendance today. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today. Kirsten Reed is a PhD candidate at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. She is also the conservation biologist at Yukon Conservation Society and an instructor at Yukon University. So after getting hooked on northern ecosystems and field research after a field course in Yellowknife in 2013, Kirsten has been researching forest growth, wildfires, biodiversity, and ecosystem changes in the Yukon and Northwest Territories ever since. Kirsten lives in Whitehorse, and I will pass the floor over to you, Kirsten, to give your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thanks everybody for being here today. Today we're going to talk about vegetation change in the Yukon, what we've already seen as a result of climate change and how things are going to potentially change in the future. And a majority of this presentation is sort of centered around a paper that we had published a couple months ago. Okay, so I'm not going to get into sort of the nitty-gritties of climate change in the Yukon. If you're interested in sort of all of the facts and figures, there's an excellent publication that I've put there. It's about all of the Yukon-specific changes that we have experienced and projections for Yukon in the future. And it's a really invaluable resource. But just a couple of things that sort of stand out when we think about climate change in the Yukon. Number one, we've seen average temperature increase. So over the past 50 years, temperatures in the Yukon have increased by about 2 degrees Celsius. And most of this warming has happened in the winter. So over the past 50 years, again, we've seen about 4 degrees Celsius of warming over the winter. So things are warming, and it's mainly in the winter. And when we look forward into the future, these patterns continue. So over the next 50 years, depending on the emission scenario, we expect to see temperatures increase by a further 0.7 to 3.7 degrees. And again, most of this warming is going to happen in the winter. On top of this warming, on top of these air temperature changes, we're also seeing increased precipitation, especially in the summer. And I think most folks who live in the Yukon can relate to this. We've definitely had a lot of rainy summers recently. We're also seeing increased rates of permafrost thaw events. So whether this is permafrost underneath infrastructure, underneath roads and buildings, etc., whether it's in rivers and lakes, or whether it's entire hillsides that are sort of sloughing off after these large retrogressive permafrost thaw events. We're seeing an increased rate of these events happening. We're seeing increased melting of glaciers and of sea ice. We're seeing increased flood risk. And again, this is another one that Yukoners can really relate to, I think, because past couple of summers, we know that Southern Lakes has had a lot of flooding. And we're also seeing earlier river ice breakup throughout the Yukon. And in general, this can sort of all be summarized as talking about increased climate variability. So we're seeing changes to these climate parameters, changes to things like air temperature and precipitation, etc. We're also seeing these big disturbance events happen sort of at greater frequency, etc. But also sort of with increasing variability in terms of their temporal trends. And as a result of these climatic changes, shifts in vegetation distribution are projected. So I'm just going to apologize. Somebody's about to walk in the door right now. But anyways, so shifts in vegetation distribution are projected. And as the climate envelopes or bubbles of certain climatic conditions shift, it really follows that the vegetation that has been supported by these climate envelopes will also shift. And so in the Yukon, projections suggest that biome shifts are going to be quite large. And so if we look at these two figures here from a publication in 2016, The top figure shows the distribution of biomes throughout the Yukon in the baseline period of 1961 to 1990. And you can see there's a lot of different colors there corresponding to a lot of different biomes throughout the Yukon. So these are sort of different vegetation units. And we know that the Yukon is quite diverse in terms of its biomes, in terms of its vegetation units, etc. And we can think of this just in terms of things that we recognize on the ground. You know, the forest composition and the way the landscape looks changes as you go from sort of these productive forests down in Watson Lake. We've got grasslands out in Fulani, more forests sort of up in the Dawson area, and then tundra in and around the Arctic Circle. And so the projections for the 2090s, if you look at the bottom there, we can see a couple things. Number one, the number of biomes in the Yukon is going to change. It's going to decrease. We're going to see less of these different types of vegetation units, but also the distribution of these vegetation units is also really going to change. And so if we look on the west side of the territory there in and around Dawson, in the top image, we can see northern boreal forest, these kind of forests that we see today in Dawson. But down into the 2090s, this is going to shift towards more of a southern boreal forest towards aspen parkland. And this is really a vegetation type that is sort of more analogous with what we see in present day Saskatchewan or British Columbia. So obviously a huge change if this is the type of forest that happens in the Dawson area. And just in general, some of the biome shifts that we might expect to see under future warming projections include things like boreal forests shifting to grasslands, Arctic tundra shifting to shrublands and forest, alpine tundra also shifting to forest, and then forest communities just generally shifting both elevationally, so higher up mountain ranges, but also latitudinally, so further north. In changes to the location and composition of vegetation communities is going to have ecosystem level implications and consequences for many different patterns and processes, including things like changes to the carbon cycling, litter decomposition, and a distribution of preferred habitat and migration patterns. So this is really important when we think about things like where we find caribou and moose populations browsing, where they migrate throughout the year, and where they may be changing their migration and browsing patterns in the future. And these ecosystem consequences also affect numerous governance and stewardship decisions. So management decisions such as things like where we're going to protect new areas. These decisions are going to change as we think about the vegetation communities throughout the Yukon changing. When and where we need to suppress fires. You know, if we have areas that now are dominated by grasslands, but in the future are going to be dominated by forests, that's going to change when and how we need to do fire suppression. And then finally, if we have threatened species in certain areas, but they're only living in one particular place, or one particular biome, if this biome is going to become threatened under climate change, we need to think about what that's going to mean for those species and how we can possibly help with these changes. And so as those images showed, we have a lot of projected changes. And I think it's fair to say that if, you know, a majority of those changes occur, then how the Yukon looks in 2090 is going to be vastly different than how it looks today. And this is going to affect so many different things. Like I've said, the habitat of so many animal species, where humans sort of go for subsistence hunting or gathering of berries, etc. It's also going to change things like the fire patterns, the carbon storage of the ecosystems, etc. And so knowing that we have all of these possibilities of shifts by the 2090s, you know, a timeline between the 1960s and the 2090s, 2025 marks the halfway point of that change, of that timeline, sorry. And so thinking about what vegetation changes have already happened in the Yukon can help us project what future changes might happen. And so for our paper, we set out with two main aims. Number one, we wanted to synthesize the recent documented patterns of change in different vegetation communities across the Yukon. We are interested in changes that had happened from 1980 to present. And then we also wanted to highlight Yukon-specific knowledge gaps that can really help sort of guide our future thinking in the Yukon for how we understand vegetation change under this warming climate. And so the resulting project was a literature review that we completed. It came out in environmental reviews this past summer. If anyone's interested in reading the full paper, that QR code will take you directly to the paper. But for our literature review, we looked at published academic articles, government documents, graduate student theses, all the sort of written scientific knowledge about vegetation change in the Yukon so far. Yeah, so in our literature review, we divided the Yukon based in these bioclimate zones. And so bioclimate zones are a framework from Environment Yukon, which differentiates different regions of the Yukon based on their regional climate, soil development, vegetation patterns, etc. So it's just a way to sort of divide up where the different biological community or vegetation communities rather are in the Yukon. And the outcome of this huge lit review showed us a couple things. First of all, if we look at the findings sort of spatially, we found 29 published studies about vegetation changes in the Yukon. And, you know, we did look at studies from Alaska or the Northwest Territories to help us understand what patterns are occurring elsewhere that may occur here, but just haven't been documented yet. But in the end, it came down to just these 29 studies about vegetation changes in the Yukon. And you can see by the distribution there of those numbers as they correspond to those bioclimate zones that there's not an even distribution of studies throughout the whole Yukon. Most studies are occurring in the boreal low. The boreal low tends to be sort of Yukon's more productive forest stands, etc. So there's a lot of understanding about how drought especially will influence these stands. Boreal low also tends to be where people live. If you look at the map, the communities tend to be centered in these sort of boreal low areas. And so obviously the boreal low has a lot of studies. Other places, for example, the subarctic woodland and subarctic subalpine, there's only 4 studies documenting changes there. And this is a pretty big area. You know, this is going from just north of Dawson up into Old Crow. And so obviously the vegetation, etc., there changes quite significantly. And so these are some of the things that we highlighted in our knowledge gaps. We highlighted 32 knowledge gaps that could help direct future research in the Yukon to understand, you know, what patterns need to be looked into next in different places and different vegetation units, etc. I'm not going to go over all of the knowledge gaps here, but they are in the paper if folks are interested in reading them. So apart from the sort of spatial distribution patterns here, we did find sort of 4 main patterns about how vegetation has already changed in the Yukon. And so that's what I want to highlight here next. So the first pattern is that it's time to move. Things are already moving throughout the Yukon. So we're seeing tree lines moving and we're seeing shrub communities moving. And the research for these patterns in the Yukon tends to be aggregated in southwestern Yukon. A lot of this research comes out of the Fulani region. And so we're seeing white spruce tree lines move further upslope. We're seeing them get denser. We're seeing the trees in them get taller. And we're seeing very similar patterns in the willow shrub communities. So willow shrubs are moving further upslope. They're also getting denser and they're also getting bigger. If we end up in a situation where we sort of have competition between these expanding trees and these expanding shrubs, chances are the shrubs are going to do a little bit better. They have smaller, more windborne seeds, and so they may be able to outcompete the trees if we have a situation where we have both trees and shrubs expanding in the same area. This isn't something that's been explicitly studied in the Yukon, but this is sort of what the Alaskan evidence suggests. On the other end of the territory, up in Herschel Island, we're also seeing willows get denser. They're getting taller, and they're also changing. And as they do this, they're changing how the landscape looks and how the ecosystem functions. And so the important thing when considering species moving, these tree lines and these shrub communities moving further upslope, is that ecosystems are highly interconnected systems. And so it's not just a case of these shrubs or these trees moving. It's a case of when these major ecosystem sort of characters move, other species are going to move too. And this is going to be both plant species that sort of act in symbiosis with these trees and the shrubs, but it's also going to be other species that are affected as the trees and shrubs move their distribution. So for example, as shrubs expand into the tundra biomes, suitable habitats for some tundra-dependent species are going to shrink. And this is going to include a wide variety of species, including things like thin-horned sheep, possibly barren ground caribou, things like Arctic ground squirrel, which is considered a keystone species, and then also some rare and endemic plant species. So these changes to the distribution of vegetation in these elevational places is going to have a huge influence on the rest of the biological community. The second pattern we found is that drought is really driving change. So the projections for the Yukon, like I alluded to earlier, is that we're going to have increased rain and decreased snow. But this increased rain doesn't necessarily reflect, or isn't necessarily reflected as an increase in plant available moisture. So we are seeing drought throughout the Yukon, and there is documented evidence of drought in both white spruce and aspen populations. And so when we have drought in the white spruce populations, the general pattern is there is reduced growth. So these white spruce forests that are drought stressed are reducing their growth. If we have continued drought, if we have more drought as these climate patterns continue, white spruce might be pushed into cooler and moister locations. And the problem with this potential shift is that currently in cool and moist location, we have black spruce. And so we have the potential for these white spruce to be encroaching into the areas that black spruce take up. And then the question arises, is there room for both? And that's sort of a possible trajectory that could take place, but whether or not it's going to happen, what the outcomes of that will be, are unknown. Aspen is also being quite highly affected by drought, and aspen might be able to replace white spruce in these continued drought conditions. If this does happen, if we have a big shift from sort of white spruce dominance to aspen dominance in these areas of drought, that could be really good for the carbon storage of the ecosystem, as these aspen forests, these deciduous forests, can sequester more carbon long-term than some of these coniferous forests. But again, that's a trajectory that may or may not happen, and the fine details of that, as it were, are really not hammered out yet. The other place that we see drought is back in southwestern Yukon in Kewaunee. There's an interesting interplay between drought and aspen and grasslands. And so aspen have expanded into grasslands with existing drought. And if this continues, we may lose some grassland specific species in these places. But future drought conditions may also mean that grasslands expand. And so there's going to be this really interesting sort of interplay and relationship between the aspen, the grassland, and the drought, seeing what is going to expand where. The third pattern is that the inertia is strong. So despite the chronic press of climate change, despite these continuous increases in temperature and changes to precipitation pattern, the ecosystem's inertia, its inherent resistance to change, is very strong. And this has a lot to do with the fact that northern plant species, they can tolerate pretty harsh conditions for quite a few years. And so as these conditions are changing, the plant species are able to sort of withstand this chronic pressure of a warming climate. Overall, throughout the Yukon, we are seeing that most vegetation units are quite resilient to this sort of background warming, as it were. But for systems to overcome this inertia, the system's instinct to stay the same, as it were, is going to be really tough. So, for example, I talked earlier about how willow shrubs on Herschel Island are increasing their height, they're increasing their density. They're primed to increase their spread as well. They're primed to take over more land. They're ready to go. They're ready to move. But the inherent inertia of the system is not allowing them to do this. So the surrounding vegetation, the surrounding topography and landscape has a handful of physical and chemical barriers that the willows are going to need to overcome in order to expand their range. And it seems that right now they just do not have this ability to overcome this inertia of the system. And so many systems or most systems are sort of resilient to this sort of background general warming, but we're also seeing that some systems are also resistant to sort of sudden disturbances that are coming through as well. And the most notable example of this in the Yukon is in Kluane, where spruce bark beetle had a large outbreak in the 90s. The forest pre-beetle disturbance was dominated by white spruce. This disturbance came through and destroyed a majority of the seed-bearing trees, a majority of the mature trees. And so there was the opportunity for the system to change, for it to come back as another vegetation type after this disturbance. But the system was seemingly quite resilient. The system came back as white spruce once again. So again, that's the inertia of this system coming through and sort of not allowing the system to change. So it started as white spruce, it had this big disturbance, and it came back as white spruce again. That's not always the case for these sort of abrupt disturbances. Often cases, abrupt disturbances lead to abrupt changes. And so this is particularly apparent after both wildfire and permafrost thaw events. So we're seeing after wildfire events, which wildfires are happening with more frequency and more severity after climate change, we are tending to see a shift into a different type of vegetation dominance there. So these systems that were black spruce before fire are transitioning to any handful of other vegetation dominance, including white spruce, including deciduous trees, deciduous shrubs, or grasslands, depending on where you are. After permafrost thaw, after these big retrogressive thaw slumps, we're seeing the system change into sort of, again, from a more coniferous system into a more deciduous system. And particularly for these permafrost thaw events, the medium to long-term scenarios of these changes is pretty unclear at this time. Whether or not these new deciduous dominated scenarios will persist, or whether the system will eventually shift back into a coniferous dominated system remains unclear. And so this is another area where future work is really, really important. And so all of these patterns, all of these documented changes kind of leave us wondering what's next. And so I highlighted that, vegetation change really affects many different biological and management processes. So it affects the carbon cycling of the ecosystem, or sorry, the carbon storage of the ecosystem, the nutrient cycling of the ecosystem. But it also affects many different management decisions. It affects where we're putting protected areas, how we're creating land use plans, etc. And so thinking about how these vegetation units have changed and may continue to change is really important as we sort of move forward with these decisions. And it's really important and also tricky because there is a lot of variability across time and space. We did highlight that there are these four main patterns happening throughout the Yukon, but the variability within each bioclimate zone, across each bioclimate zone, within black spruce forest or white spruce forest, there's a ton of variability there depending on all of the different climate variables, etc. at play. And so this kind of leaves us thinking, what can we do about these changes? There's a lot of changes happening. There's a lot of changes projected for the future, but what exactly do we do about it? And I'm not really here today with an answer as to what we do about it, but there are some things that we can think about for the future. And so there's a framework from Alaska. It's called the Resist, Accept, Direct framework. And it thinks about ecosystems changing with climate change and what managers and or practitioners can do about these changes. And the framework suggests that we really have three options about how we deal with change. We can resist the change, we can accept the change, or we can direct the change. And I think it's fair to say that in Yukon, like most other places, we've generally been accepting these changes. Vegetation communities have changed to varying degrees in the past, but as a society, we haven't really intervened. They've changed, and we've just sort of accepted this. And in a majority of cases of change, this is what we'll have to do. We'll have to just sort of accept the change, and this is what has happened. But there are two other options. We could resist the change and we could direct the change. And these bear thinking about, even if it's just more of a food for thought exercise. And so when we resist the change, we can sort of identify and protect certain landscapes where we think fire and or drought are least likely. And if we protect these landscapes, then we give the wildlife and the plant species that are there a better chance of surviving under these new and changing conditions. We could also direct the change. And so in this case, directing the change would be sort of helping the migration of certain species, certain plant species. Maybe we can plant spruce or pine in places that they haven't yet been able to get to. And so we can really sort of direct these changes, direct these vegetation communities under ongoing climate change. So in summary, our paper sort of found these four main patterns. Number one, we have documented examples of species moving throughout the Yukon, mainly trees and shrubs. We're seeing drought being a significant driver of change. The inertia of these communities is strong. They are quite resilient to change, and a big change in the climate variables or a big disturbance is generally required to shift them into a different vegetation type. But when we do have these abrupt disturbances, we are seeing abrupt changes, etc. And so with that, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. My email address is down there on the bottom if anyone has any questions afterwards, but I'm also happy to take questions now if there's anything. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that great presentation, Kirsten. So yeah, we'll open the floor up for questions. So again, a gentle reminder, just keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking. And you can ask a question by raising your hand like this if your video is on, or by using the reaction button in Zoom. There's a little reaction symbol there. If you click on that, then you should see an option to stick up a hand. Or you can also type your question in the chat, and I can ask it for you if you prefer. So any questions? I did see one in the chat during the presentation. I think looking for clarification. So maybe I can start with that. Just make sure I'm not missing any hands here. Okay, I don't see any new hands. So I'll start with that, and it's coming from so our Annette. That's and I'll would you like to speak to this, or I can just go ahead and read it out? Okay, I'll go ahead and read that out. So so our Annette is looking for some clarification on some of your presentation. So initially, so you were saying that things were getting wetter, but then you were saying that things were, that there'd also be drought. So there was just some confusion about what that means, and a request that if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So the experienced climate change stuff that's already happened, and also projections for the future, do suggest that there's going to be more rain. So increased amount of actual sort of rain happening every year. But at the same time as that, we're also going to see increasing air temperatures. And so we have increasing rain, but also increasing air temperatures. So there's going to be higher amounts of evapotranspiration. So there will be more rain, but there'll also be more warming. And so there'll be more water leaving the system, or more water transpiring out of the system. So as a result of these two pressures, we're going to have, we will generally have drought. So more rain, but even more warm air ends up with drought. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for that clarification. That was helpful for me too. I see there is a question here. Someone has their hand up. It says M.A. White. Sorry, I'm not sure what your name is there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Maxine White. I'm adaptation analyst with the Climate Change Secretariat at Government of Yukon. One of the questions I had was, to what extent did you see examples or recommendations of actions or measures that, like kind of that you spoke to, the resist or direct change? Did you see any examples of that in the literature you reviewed, whether in the Yukon or in other jurisdictions?
Off the top of my head, I would say no. I can't think of any examples of that in the literature. I think I think mainly that's to do with sort of, you know, now we have the trends, now we can see what is happening, and so maybe now it's the time for the discussion as to what we do. I think, you know, from a very like simplistic perspective, we can't make a decision on what to do until we know what's happening. And I think we're there. I think we have the evidence now. We kind of know what patterns things are taking, etc. And so now we can start to put forward some of these plans. The RAD framework itself is pretty new, and so it has been used in some situations, but I can't think of any sort of even other outside of Yukon, but sort of northern examples, not that I can think of now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So I see there's a hand up, but a question came in on the chat before, so I'll start with that one, and then I'll move to, I think that might be Richard. So I'll start with the one in the chat from Sebastian Jones. So I'll go ahead and read that out, unless Sebastian, you'd prefer speaking to it. Okay, I'll just go ahead and read it out. So here's the question. How do you see these changes affecting caribou range and distribution?
Thanks. Yeah, I think sort of big picture, a couple of things. Number one, if we see continued increase in fire frequency, that's going to change or has the potential to change the distribution of forest, etc. And as we change the distribution of forest, we change the distribution of the lichen, which is really important food source for the caribou. And so as some of our forested areas either become less forested or not forested, we have the potential to significantly reduce the amount of lichen that is there. And so this is really going to change caribou migration patterns for some of the migratory caribou herds. And then also I think there'll be a lot of other sort of smaller changes that are perhaps not as they won't be as easily sort of documented big scale as, you know, the wildfire caribou lichen pathway, but you know, as all these different species start to move, as I was saying, other species will move in concert with them. And so as we see sort of more understory species, etc., sort of moving throughout the landscape, which is going to be a long process. It's not going to happen overnight by any means. But as we sort of see berries changing their distribution, or other sort of understory vegetation species changing their distribution, these will also sort of have knock-on effects on the caribou. But the fire lichen distribution will definitely sort of be the main one, the prominent one in the immediate future.
Thanks for that. So I see we have another question coming in from Arnett. I think that's Richard. Is that you? Do you have another question?
I do. Thanks, Kirsten. That was really thought-provoking. A couple of things I'd like to discuss. One is on, call me sad, but I took a 3-inch manual out of EMR library the other week on insects, and it's like we got something like 8,000 different insect varieties in the Yukon, and you're saying that our biodiversity is probably going to shrink because of the habitat changes. So you're saying basically we're going to be losing a stack of insect diversity as well, following on from the vegetation changes.
Are you asking if I think we're going to lose insect diversity?
Yeah.
I think there's the potential to. I don't think it's as cut and dry as, you know, vegetation diversity changes and therefore insect diversity changes. I think as the vegetation diversity changes, it definitely has the ability to change the insect diversity, etc. But we also have to think about where the vegetation diversity is shifting, what vegetation exactly it is that these invertebrates are relying on, because they're all not going to be relying on the same vegetation. They're not going to be relying on the same vegetation in, you know, throughout the Yukon. Different insects in different parts of the Yukon are going to be relying on different things. So yeah, it's definitely a possibility that reduced vegetation diversity will reduce insect diversity. Is it you know, like a very linear relationship. I don't think so.
Okay. Second thing I was going to ask you, EMR has got a whole load of aerial photographs and from different ages, and I'm just wondering how relevant it would be to try and review those over the decades they've been taken, to see if you can figure out in those areas where you're lacking data whether they could help you out there, see what's changing.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the research gaps that we did highlight was that you know, an increased reliance on future remote sensing and future aerial photographs could be extremely helpful, but also relying on previous documented images can also be super helpful. Even if it's just sort of big picture changes about sort of expanding or reduced distribution of trees, etc. Yeah, that's definitely something that could be important.
Was it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Just see any other questions. I don't see any hands up, but I don't want to be missing anyone. Oh, Bob, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. And it's about sort of, I guess, the political imperative to draw definitive permanent lines for, you know, settlement or land claim settlement areas or protected areas or land use planning. And this seems to drive us more to an adaptive management approach almost, or a recognition that things are changing and an area you may want to protect because of an ecosystem or a species or medicinal plants at one point in time may move at another point. How do we sort of change the bigger dialogue to recognize that these sort of permanent lines aren't effective?
That is an excellent and very large question. I think the way to do it is sort of connected protected areas. I think, you know, we can think about sort of, we have the species here right now, and so we're going to protect this area, and that's great. But things are changing, and things are changing pretty rapidly, and so maybe it's going to end up over here pretty soon. And so if there's no connection between these two places, you know, if we have either sort of topographic reasons that the species can't move from one to the other, you know, there's no point in putting one protected area on one side of the tombstones and the other protected area on the other side of the tombstones. Like, species are not going to make it there for, I don't know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And so, so whether it's topographic or whether it's, you know, major road networks, human settlements, etc. Thinking about how we can connect these protected areas. And so I think protected area network planning is really important. But yeah, thinking about how spatially they are connected, how we're protecting places for now versus places for the future. There's a lot of trade-offs there. I'm definitely not an expert in making those decisions, but it's a big conversation, but it's a conversation that's important, and I think needs to start sooner rather than later, and so that we can sort of end up in more of a proactive position rather than necessarily reactive.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that question. Just seeing if there are any other questions. I'll check the chat. Okay, I have a question then. I hope I didn't miss this. Maybe you covered this. I was doing some chat stuff so on this Zoom platform, so I hope I didn't miss it. But I wanted to know, did you look at different vegetation distribution scenarios for different temperature increase scenarios?
No, we didn't, not in this project. So this project was just reviewing the literature that already exists about what's already happened. But thinking about different projection scenarios for the future is definitely important. The paper where I highlighted the 2 images of the biome shifts, they've done that in that paper as well. But yeah, thinking about this, how things are going to change in the different scenarios is definitely an important next step.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I think I did grab that paper. That's the paper you're referring to, the one where you that you included the link on in your presentation. Is that the one? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I can share that with the video too in the scope newsletter so people can access that if they want to. Okay, thank you. Oh, I think we have another question from Richard.
Yeah, your question sort of triggered something else in my mind. We're seeing in Siberia these huge heat waves and fires and whatnot, and that seems to me like a catastrophic change. Do you think that kind of stuff will happen on the North Slope here as well in due course? That'll really switch things over?
It's definitely a possibility. In Alaska, you don't even have to go as far as Siberia. In Alaska, they have had documented tundra fires.
Oh yeah, last few years. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, they have experienced, or they have like studied how the vegetation has grown back after those tundra fires, how it changes the nutrient cycling, etc. So these changes are definitely a possibility. There haven't been documented tundra fires or many documented tundra fires as far as I'm aware in the Yukon, and that's for sure a research gap that we highlighted in our study is, you know, when these tundra fires do happen, getting in there and understanding how the ecosystem is responding, because yeah, like you said, they are going to become more common, and so really understanding the results of them is important.
The other thing that seems to be going on up north is the loss of lake habitats as well, with permafrost melting and them draining out. This is completely unrelated, but in Africa, when they built the Kariba Dam, it changed the local temperatures and turned them almost into desert areas. So I'm just wondering how a loss of lakes up on the North Shore area would affect things there as well.
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think there's many places in that scenario. There's many places that things could change. You know, as we lose sort of each individual lake, there's going to be changes to the surrounding vegetation of that lake. And if we're losing multiple lakes in close proximity to each other, the edge effects and the range of these effects is just really going to continue to expand. And so you do have the potential to have changing vegetation and changing vegetation dynamics over pretty large areas potentially. Also, the animals that rely on these lakes, whether they're in the lakes or whether they're sort of feeding from the lakes, they're going to end up changing their distribution as well. And this is also going to have a change on the vegetation. So yeah, I can't really speak to those changes directly, but the potential for changes and the potential for cascading changes is pretty huge.
That's the thing I was trying to get after, is the cascade effects and how rapid they would be, like trigger points. Yeah, interesting stuff. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have a question? Just looking through, making sure I didn't miss a hand or anything like that. Okay, I don't see anything else. So I think that's it. Thank you so much, Kirsten, for that really wonderful presentation and for answering all of our questions. So I will make a recording of this presentation available, as I said, through our Scope e-newsletter and through our Facebook page, and also include the link to the paper that you provided, Kirsten, so people can read that if they like. And that is all. Thank you so much for attending, everyone. And thanks again, Kirsten, for that great talk.
Thank you.
Okay.